Now, when it comes to suspension and life, balance is very important. Not only are we trying to strike a balance between the priorities of grip and support, but we're also trying to balance between our fork and our shock. Without balance, we'll always be trying to play catch up. Today, we're making this video with the support of Olin, so we're gonna use their products. But the processes to achieve balance will work regardless of the brand. So, how do we do that? Well, suspension is there to suspend us. And we do that because we want to keep our bodies stable on the bike. As our weight moves forwards and backwards, the suspension has an incredibly hard task of keeping us stable and smooth. It does this by coming into its stroke under compression, but also by extending. And that leads us to an important question. What is sag and why do we need it? Don't we just want the most unused amount of travel available for those really big hits? Perhaps not. Now I want you to imagine you've got a big downhill fork. The fork's got 200 millimeters of travel and you run it at 25% sag. That means that the fork can extend 50 millimeters from sag to full travel. If you rode over a small hole in the trail that was 50 millimeters deep, the fork, if set up correctly, would be able to extend and follow the shape of the hole. If you ran your fork with very little sag and ran it really stiff to take those big hits, it wouldn't be able to extend by the same amount. Less sag would not only give us a harsher feeling bike with less grip, especially under braking, but it also means that it undoes many of the reasons that we run front suspension in the first place, for a more consistent feeling. So why don't we run 40 to 50% sag then? Because while the bike still needs to be able to extend into holes, it's also very important that it can still cope with big hits. With suspension, its ability to compress means that we can keep the chassis of the bike more consistent. How much sag you run in either your fork or a shock depends on your setup and what you're trying to do. Generally speaking, the holes we encounter on a cross-country ride are a bit smaller, plus we want more efficiency. But they also have less travel available to begin with. That means that as the bike goes through the travel, the damper has less available stroke to slow down that shaft speed. Why though do we have different amounts of sag in our shocks compared to our forks? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Quite simply, we tend to run as much sag as we can without bottoming out. But there are some more nuanced factors as well, which can become more important when you think about axle paths and braking on a mountain bike. Setting sag is about embracing, not ignoring the different demands that we put on our fork and our shock. Another huge factor in getting your bike set up is the compression and rebound adjustments. Damper settings can be a lot to take in. So let's break it down with how a high-end damper works. Now there's a lot of variations with this system here, but it's largely true across many brands. Our dampers work by restricting or diverting oil. As we compress our suspension, it pushes the oil through small holes. It's by restricting the size of the holes or the ease of the flow that slows the oil down and subsequently slows the rate at which the suspension can compress or extend. The more travel an impact uses, the more oil it wants to move through that port. Let's think of it in really simple terms. Here I've got a run-of-the-mill funnel. Now you can see that when I start to pour a small amount of liquid through this hole slowly, it can run through easily. This represents slow movements or movements that might be fast or use little travel, such as tracking over small bumps that don't use a lot of oil. To change the low-speed compression damping on this fork would be like changing the size of the hole at the bottom of the funnel. But what about high-speed damping? Well, high-speed damping is all about what happens when the oil wants to move faster through the system than the small hole will allow. I want you to imagine that you have a full travel, bottom-out scenario off of a big drop. This moves all your oil at once. Suddenly, the funnel hole is overwhelmed and it diverts through and over the top. This is very similar to how a damper works, but instead of over the funnel, it's being sent through the high-speed compression circuit, which on high-end shocks, you can also adjust independently. Low-speed compression is when the shaft speed is slow or the movement is small. We want to tune it for our body's mass. It sets the threshold before the oil diverts to the shims of the high-speed damping circuit. The threshold for this is relatively low, so although high-speed damping sounds very intimidating, it also dictates the feeling for most compressions, be them big or small. Too much high-speed compression and the bike can begin to feel harsh, and instead of the wheel being pushed into its travel, it will begin to lift the bike. My advice would be to set your sag. Then run your high and low speed compression settings right in the middle. If you need to make adjustments, you can add or subtract a bit based on your comfort or how hard you're pushing. Rebound is another damping adjustment, but this changes how fast your bike returns to full travel. If you're running a higher spring rate or more air pressure, you tend to need to run more rebound damping to slow all that energy down as it tries to return. Somebody that runs less air pressure or a lower spring rate tends to run less rebound damping. Again, on the topic of balance, we want our bikes to be able to extend to full travel to follow all the holes and bumps as needed. But too fast and it can feel like we're getting thrown about. Too slow and it's as if the bike never returns to full travel. Worse yet, it's so slow that it leaves us riding deep into the stroke where the spring rate is higher. This can not only give us less grip and support, but it can also be very uncomfortable. All mountain bikers know how important it is to set your rebound. But it's also important to consider how the fork and shock work in unison. Our weight will follow the path of least resistance. If your fork is oversprung and with maximum compression, it just means that we'll put more weight around our shock, and vice versa. Not only do we want sag set up correctly, but we also want to be running it at a similar percentage of total travel used in the front and back. Now, if you're bottoming one out all the time, but hardly using the other, go back to setting sag and confirm you're not putting all your weight through one end of the bike. As a general rule of thumb, pushing harder needs more high-speed compression damping. So don't be afraid to use all of the available adjustments. They're there for a reason. Now that was a load of information thrown your way, but really what it boils down to is achieving balance. Now we have plenty of adjustments available to us on our bike, so don't be scared. Tweak a couple of things out on your next bike ride, and when you find something that works good for you, write it down. That way you're not starting from scratch every single time. Now if you want to check out the previous videos we did on fork setup or shock setup, we're going to link to those below.